Okay, so we are about to get into all of the little logical relationships that go on with cardiovascular physiology. Before we do, I want to introduce you to a concept map that I made to help me understand cardiovascular physiology, and I'm going to use it with you guys too. If you don't like learning this way, it's fine. It's the same material that's in your notes, but for some people who are really visual, it helps to see the visual relationships between these things. So before we go any further, let me show you where we were before. So what we basically said before was that the point of the whole cardiovascular physiology is really blood flow, right? So the overriding functionality of the cardiovascular system is to ensure adequate blood flow to capillary beds. So this is really the function that overrides all other functions. And then we said before that the relationship is that F, which is flow, equals delta P, right? The difference in pressure between 2 points, over R, which is resistance, okay? And so what we are going to do today is we are going to really focus on how you can generate that pressure. Primarily, we're going to start with the heart, and then we'll be talking about blood volume. But a couple things about this concept map is it's way bigger than this, but I don't want to show it all to you at one time because it gets overwhelming. The second thing is that this is linked at the bottom of this set of notes in two forms. In a PDF form, the whole thing, unfolded, complete, is linked in a PDF form. Or if you have access, and last time I checked, it was only for Apple devices, but that may not be right now. The program is called MindNode. If you have access to MindNode or want to use it, there might be a free version, there might not, there used to be. Then you can actually download the MindNode version that you can manipulate and make it look however you want. Before we go any further with that, though, let's talk about the things that we did last time in the last sets of videos. What we talked about was resistance, right? And resistance primarily occurred in the vessels, not in the heart. And resistance was the opposition to flow between 2 points at a given delta P, meaning I'm holding pressure constant. What can make it harder or easier for blood to flow between those 2 points? And we basically said that there were these things: the vessel elasticity, the vessel length, the viscosity of the blood, and then the vessel diameter. We also said that these guys right here don't change very frequently in a healthy person, healthy grown person, I should say. So this is the primary one that we use as a regulatory mechanism. We can increase or decrease resistance, right, to change blood flow patterns, like with vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So that's where we were last time. Today, what we're going to be talking about is how the heart determines blood pressure and therefore blood flow, right? Because it's F equals delta P over R. Notice that when there is a direct correlation, then I've made it a green line, as in this is a positive correlation. And when there's an inverse correlation, I've made it a red line. And sometimes those are really consistent and sometimes they're not. And sometimes the colors will be meaningful to you and sometimes they won't. When it's not always a direct or indirect relationship, I've made it a different color. So, okay. So what we're going to be starting on right now is cardiac output, which is kind of what it sounds like. Cardiac output is really the concept of how much blood ejects from a ventricle per minute. Now, unless I tell you otherwise, assume that we're talking about systemic circulation and therefore the left ventricle. But pulmonary circulation is, of course, important, but it doesn't have as much pressure and it's a little less likely to go bad on you. So cardiac output is where we are, abbreviated CO. It's the amount of blood that's ejected from a ventricle per minute. And it's measured in units of volume per units of time, usually liters per minute or milliliters per minute. And it's basically determined by two factors, which is heart rate, which is how many times the ventricle contracts per minute, right? and then stroke volume. And the stroke volume is how much blood leaves the ventricle per squirt. So this should make sense to you, right? Cardiac output right here is heart rate times stroke volume. Okay, that's your cardiac output. And so let's talk about that and think about that for just a second. The number of heartbeats per minute. So how could I increase cardiac output? I could either increase heart rate or I could increase stroke volume. Stroke volume is a little harder for people to understand than heart rate, and we'll do that one in just a second. But this interactive activity right here in cardiac output, it's fantastic for those of you who like to fiddle with things. So let's just do that one really quickly. Hopefully this link works for you, but let me show you that it just lets you manipulate simple little things so that the concepts click in your head. So this is just part of this, right? So there's a whole bunch. I would go through the whole thing if I were you, but I'm going to start right here, which is this activity. You'll be asked to predict how changes in heart rate and stroke volume will affect cardiac output. You'll then be asked to test your predictions by manipulating heart rate and stroke volume to see the effects on cardiac output. So you're sitting on a couch. Since you are at rest, your heart rate is 75 beats per minute, which is within normal. Your heart's stroke volume is 70 milliliters per heartbeat, which is within normal. And your cardiac output at rest is about 5.25 liters per minute, which, just note to yourself, that's almost a person's whole blood volume per minute at rest. But suddenly a satellite crashes in on the roof, and that's totally expected for 2020, isn't it? Your heart rate increases to 110 beats per minute. What does that do to your cardiac output? So let's try just 3 questions here. So if my heart rate increases, you guys can do math. This will cause your cardiac output to increase, right? Okay, and I'm going to hit submit. Test your prediction. Drag the heart rate slider to 110 beats per minute, and then check. And I got it right. So notice that my cardiac output went up pretty significantly to 7.7 liters per minute. Let's try the next one. Patient is given a drug that decreases stroke volume, but does not impact heart rate. If the patient's cardiac output is initially 6.75 liters per minute, how will the drug affect cardiac output? If you decrease the stroke volume, you can do math, right? This will cause the patient's cardiac output to decrease, right? Hit submit. Drag the stroke volume slider bar down to 70 mils per beat. Check your prediction. We are correct. One more time. One more thing. Next. You are jogging to class. Your heart rate is 150 beats per minute. Your heart's stroke volume is 90 milliliters per beat. What is your cardiac output? You could do math. I just estimated, and I got it right. And that is that. And they want you to prove it. Drag the heart rate slider to 150 beats per minute. Drag the stroke volume to 90. And then check your prediction. Okay, so the exercise here was very simple, but it's basically just to make you experience how either heart rate or stroke volume or both can impact your cardiac output. So now let us get into what's going on here. So this is a typical adult cardiac output example. Stroke volume of 0.07 liters per beat. We could do that in milliliters if we wanted to, which is around a quarter cup, by the way. And the heart rate within normal of about 72 beats per minute. If you multiply that out, it gives you about 5 liters per minute at rest. So again, women tend to have about 5 liters of blood and men tend to have about 6. It's dependent on body size, so it's not dependent so much on sex. But that means at rest, most of us are pumping close to our entire blood volume at rest. So the thing that I want to talk about is how do we control cardiac output? Well, you control cardiac output by controlling heart rate and controlling stroke volume. There's a whole bunch of different ways to impact your heart rate, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to impact your stroke volume. Now, stroke volume is the one that people have trouble with. So I'm going to try to break this down, and I want you to be really critical of, like, did I understand this part before I go on? And the terminology, you have to be super clear about the terminology. So make sure you get it before you move on. So This is a figure, right? Okay, so let's talk about a few things. So, factors impacting stroke volume. Well, the first thing is this guy right here, which is called afterload. So stick with me for a second. So, from the ventricles, of course, left or right, you pump into the arteries, including the aorta. Okay. Afterload is the pressure in the arteries that you are pumping against. Okay. And remember, I need a difference in pressure in order for blood to move forward, in order for blood to flow. So if the pressure in the arteries is higher and you don't change the pressure in the ventricles, then you are not going to get as much blood out because there's not as much delta P. So afterload is defined as the arterial pressure against which the ventricles must pump. Increased arterial pressure tends to do what to stroke volume? What do you think? If I increase the pressure in the aorta, what will happen to the amount of blood that leaves when I contract the left ventricle? What do you think? Increase or decrease? Increased arterial pressure that I'm pushing against. Increased P2, if you will, okay, tends to do what to stroke volume? To the amount of blood that leaves the heart. If you increase the pressure in the arteries and don't increase the pressure in the heart, then the delta P drops and the flow drops. It tends to decrease stroke volume. So let's fill that in quickly. Tends to decrease stroke volume. Afterload increases, by the way, and stroke volume decreases with hypertension. So if you have chronic hypertension, the hypertension is existing because maybe a combination of vasoconstriction and arteriosclerosis, what happens is that increases the amount of pressure in your vessels. And unless you increase the amount of pressure that your heart is generating, you are going to drop the amount of flow. So let's put that into our, where did it go? So stroke volume. So let's start. The first thing that impacts stroke volume, and let's focus on stroke volume for a minute, get in there on stroke volume, okay, is the first thing that impacts stroke volume is afterload, which is the arterial pressure. What is the impact of afterload? Afterload, red, decreases stroke volume, okay, you with me? Afterload decreases stroke volume. Okay, the reason there's a line between this is because also vasoconstriction can add to afterload, but we can talk about that later. So everybody cool with afterload, which is the pressure in the arteries that you are pushing against. If that increases, the stroke volume will drop. Okay, so that's the concept of afterload. Now we're going to get into the one that confuses people. Expect yourself to have to go through this one several times before it really, really clicks. Okay, so the next concept is the concept of EDV. EDV is end diastolic ventricular volume. End diastolic ventricular volume, or end diastolic volume. I say ventricular because you need to know what we're talking about the volume of. Okay, so before we go any further, let's break down that term and see if we can make it meaningful to us. The volume in the ventricles at the end of diastole. Okay, volume in the ventricles at the end of diastole. So the volume in the ventricles at the end of diastole, which is right before systole, okay, is going to have a direct impact on the amount of blood that leaves, which is the stroke volume. So there's a direct correlation between EDV, end diastolic ventricular volume, and stroke volume, okay? So the volume of the ventricles just before contraction, which is at the end of diastole. So my prediction, and I hope your prediction, is that increased EDV tends to do what to stroke volume? It tends to increase stroke volume, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Let us look at our concept mapped, and we've got EDV. As EDV increases, green, stroke volume will increase. So that's a green relationship. This was a red relationship. But now we have to figure out the factors that impact EDV. And the thing about EDV is that the volume that is in the ventricles immediately before contraction has to do not just with the amount of blood, but also with whether the chamber is stretched, because the ventricles can actually stretch. It's not like a tin can that can't really stretch, but the ventricles can get full, but that they can get fuller. Okay, so EDV, you can get amount of blood in the ventricles, and then if you get them more full, then you've got more size of chamber and therefore more blood in the ventricles. So keep that in mind for just a second. So the factors that impact EDV, the first one is the concept of preload. So let's go back to the heart and think, okay, so if we're thinking about order in which the ventricles and the arteries work, what's happening here is pre-stroke volume, preload, and what's happening here is after, okay, because the ventricles happen before the arteries. Okay, so the concept of preload. It's called ventricular end diastolic pressure, or preload. This is the amount of tension in the cardiac muscle cells of the ventricles before ventricular contraction. So basically what I'm saying here is this thing can get full, but then it can get really full. So if the ventricles are really full, then they are going to increase the volume of the ventricles that the ventricles can hold. So what's going on with preload is how full are they? Are they full or are they super full? Okay. And so how can you impact how full they are? Well, one of the things is how much filling time you actually give those ventricles. If your heart rate is beating super duper fast, then you don't have that much time for filling. If you slow it down just a little bit, then the ventricles can get really full before they contract. So filling time is kind of dependent on heart rate. So within reason, as heart rate decreases, filling time and preload both increase, okay? Now you can get too slow, right? And then the whole damn thing will shut down. The other thing that impacts it is atrial pressure. So we are going to imagine that what's going on in the ventricles happened in the atria first, okay? So the atria can get full. The atria fill because of what we call venous return, which is the passive return of blood through the veins to the atria. That's called venous return. So what happens with venous return is going to impact atrial pressure, and that's going to impact the preload, okay? But in addition, the force of atrial contraction will also impact what's in the ventricles, because the atria contract, and if they contract well enough, they're going to push that 20% of blood from the atria to the ventricles, and that's called atrial pressure. So let's look at this picture and the relationship again. So EDV has to do with preload, yes, okay, which has to do with atrial pressure and filling time. Heart rate impacts filling time, venous return impacts atrial pressure. We're going to come back to this in just a second. So these guys, preload and afterload, are the things that we have talked about right now with impacting stroke volume. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so then the other thing that impacts EDV is something called Starling's law. And Starling's law is really related to the whole volume of the ventricles thing too, but in kind of a different way. Okay, so Starling's law is this cool thing that happens in the heart that says as your venous return changes, okay, so here's your venous return, the amount of blood that is returning back through the veins. As your venous return changes, the heart automatically adjusts its output to match the inflow. And this is the figure that you're going to look at here. So as the end diastolic volume increases, the stroke volume will increase. Because why? Because cool thing about cardiac muscle sarcomeres, they actually contract better when they're stretched. They have more access to the next cross bridge and the next cross bridge and the next cross bridge. So when they are at this level of stretch, when for instance the ventricles are not very full, then they end up with this level of stroke volume. But if you stretch them, the cardiac muscle cells actually contract better. So Starling's law says that as venous return changes, the heart automatically adjusts its output to match the inflow. This actually prevents enlargement of the heart in a healthy person. So the cardiac muscle cells have an optimum length, which is like this when stretched. So not only does the volume of the ventricles, preload impacts the volume of the ventricles, but the volume of the ventricles actually impacts the strength of contraction. So they contract better when they are full. So when does this occur? Right here. Increased venous return, right? Like when you're exercising, because when you're exercising, not only is blood going out really quickly, but it's also coming back really quickly, because like when you're exercising, you push blood back up the veins. So like increased venous return, like during exercise, will more blood back in the atria means more blood in the ventricles. More blood in the ventricles means they're stretched to the sarcomeres at the optimum length. Means you're going to get more blood out. Now, what helps with venous return are two things. One of them is called the skeletal muscle pump that you're seeing right here. It means when you contract your skeletal muscle, they help move blood up through your veins, for instance, in your legs, but really everywhere that you have valves. So you squish on them and they've got a one-way valve. If you get the blood past the one-way valve, it can't go any further. And then if you squish on them a lot, like when you're exercising, then the venous return increases. So that's called the skeletal muscle pump, and you're seeing it here as well. But we also have during exercise what's called the respiratory pump. The respiratory pump is pretty cool because you guys remember that the inferior vena cava goes up through the whole ventral body cavity, and it goes up through the diaphragm, from the abdominal region through the diaphragm, through the thoracic region. Well, what happens is every single time you breathe in, your diaphragm goes from bell-shaped to flat, right? Okay. And what that does is it increases the pressure in the abdominal cavity and comparatively decreases the pressure in the thoracic cavity. So you have a higher P1 than P2 in the inferior vena cava, and you end up squirting the blood up through the inferior vena cava and increasing venous return every time you inhale. And when you are exercising, you inhale frequently and deeply, and that is called the respiratory pump. So the big picture here is stretching those sarcomeres because of this increased venous return, because of the blood going back into the ventricles. Stretching the sarcomeres causes the force of contraction to increase, and then you get more blood ejected. This is simply mechanical control. This is not even involving the nervous system or hormones yet. It just says more full, I'll actually contract better. Like stretch a rubber band, it snaps better. Think of it that way. Thus, exercise increases stroke volume and therefore increases cardiac output. The maximum amount that you can increase cardiac output above normal is called your cardiac reserve, and you can actually increase that with cardiovascular training. So let's go back to this one more time, and then I will end this video. So Starling's law, it's the length-tension relationship in cardiac muscle cells, okay? And it has to do with venous return. Hold on just a second. Oh, there. Has to do with venous return, and what impacts venous return? The skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump. Okay, so the thing I want you to see before I end this particular video, and we'll come back to this right after, is that filling time and atrial pressure both impact preload, which impacts EDV, okay? But Starling's law actually is the length-tension relationship in cardiac muscle cells. That also impacts EDV. Venous return actually impacts both of them, okay? And then the one that we're going to do next is ventricular contractility, the last way to impact stroke volume.